Hello and welcome to another webinar brought to you by the Secretariat of Child and Youth Protection at the USCCB. My name is Melanie Takinen and I am the Associate Director for the Secretariat. Before I introduce our guest today, let us begin with a prayer by Oscar Romero. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. It helps now and then to step back and take a long view. The kingdom is not only beyond our efforts, it is even beyond our vision. We accomplish in our lifetime only a tiny fraction of the magnificent enterprise that is God's work. Nothing we do is complete, which is a way of saying that the kingdom always lies beyond us. No statement says all that could be said. No prayer fully expresses our faith. No confession brings perfection. No pastoral visit brings wholeness. No program accomplishes the church's mission. No set of goals and objectives includes everything. This is what we are about. We plant the seeds that will one day grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something, and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are workers, not master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are prophets of a future, not our own. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now I would like to introduce our speakers to you for today. We have first Teresa Pitt-Green, and she's someone that many of you may know as she's done some webinars and trainings with us before. She co-founded the Healing Voices magazine and its online community, and also Spirit Fire. She served 10 years on a diocesan advisory board and currently serves as the head of the Northern Virginia Human Trafficking Task Force. Teresa is a certified mediator and runs her own publishing agency. For over 15 years, she has been promoting ways to integrate our faith with recovery from abuse. Her books and articles are used broadly in the US and internationally. Teresa spoke with Luis, one of our other guests, to the General Assembly of Bishops in Baltimore. We also have with us today Luis A. Torres Jr., who is an attorney with 30 years of experience in negotiation, communication, and facilitating dispute resolutions among diverse interest groups. Luis has been participating in his Diocesan Survivor Program, and for 17 years has served on its review board. He has spoken to the National Review Board and other groups, including speaking to the General Assembly of Bishops in Baltimore. Luis is also the co-founder of Spirit Fire, where he serves as a survivor advocate and a board member. He is currently working on a book about the integrated pastoral care model behind Spirit Fire. Luis is a husband and father of 3 daughters. And our last guest with us today is Annette Klimka from the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. She is the Victim Assistance and the Safe Environment Coordinator for the Archdiocese and has been in her position for over 10 years. Her background in child protection goes back 40 years, beginning as a police dispatcher for the Albuquerque Police Department, then transferring to the District Attorney's Office, working as a trial team secretary in violent crimes and crimes against children. Annette has a master's degree in social work and has also worked with children who were in the state's custody and with their parents to help reunite them. Her experience has given her a solid platform to work as a victim assistance coordinator by knowing the ins and outs of the reporting system, the legal system, and also the resources for help. So thank you all for being with us today. Now we're going to do things a little differently today than what we've done in the past. There's not a formal presentation because we're going to keep this really more as just an ongoing dialogue. Particularly now within the church, I mean, as we've all been in discussion for a while about this, it's been quite a busy year for the church, would be one way to put it. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of anger. So we welcome any questions that you may have as we are kind of going through our discussion today. Please go ahead and write them in the chat box, and we'll kind of go through them as we go through the webinar today as well. So just to start things off in kind of the current climate from where we're at as far as within the church in working with people who have been abused. And if you could each just take a moment to share from your perspective, how is the church doing right now as far as pastoral care for survivors? It's a very loaded question, but just if you can share a little bit on your perspective on what that feels like.
Me?
Absolutely.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks for having us here, too. I think the church is doing unevenly. It depends on the diocese, for one thing, and it depends on the degree to which a diocese has had good relationships with its survivors or has been unable to broach that chasm. So that is the first thing. And I think it's underestimated how much survivors, even who've gone through therapy and gotten help and begun to even recover spiritually, have been re-triggered and re-wounded. And some of the most solid survivors I know are really going through that. This isn't, the church now is trying, but I think there's, of course, as we all agree, there's more to be done.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, I agree. It's uneven. And, when people think of the church, they think of a great monolithic group, and they think that everything happens the same. Unfortunately, that isn't the experience for most victim survivors. It's it's different dioceses will have a different approach, a different paradigm. Some dioceses, and because a shout out to Brooklyn, Brooklyn has gone with me on my journey from the beginning, and the paradigm for there, which is I think the paradigm that VAX should adopt, is that of a social worker model. That of we're on this journey with you, we're supporting you, we're part. You're not a problem for us. You're part of what we want to be. You're part of our ministry. Unfortunately, some dioceses take it from more of a legalistic standpoint. You're a liability. Survivors aren't liabilities, and frankly, that's not consistent with what what the Gospels say and where the church should be. It's that type of thing that we need to establish more of an even protocol across the board.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you brought up a great point too, both of you, when you said that it also depends on where dioceses were too, like in the very beginning, and have they changed? Because especially in 2002, that was a lot of the focus. What you said, Louise,
right.
was it was on the litigation, and that's how a lot of these cases were being brought forward, and rightfully so. But you're right, that perspective, that can't be our focus.
Yeah.
We've got to listen to those that are impacted the most, the survivors, their families, and that has to be our focus, not whether or not we're going to go into litigation or not.
As a member of the legal profession, I'm probably going to get disbarred for everything that I say. But thank God that the legal profession has brought us to this point, where we're having this discussion, because we might not even be sitting here if not for. But we need to retake the dialogue. We need to take where it's gone to and say, okay, now this is a matter of faith. This is a matter of gospel, of spirit. So, and that's where the church needs to change the dialogue.
And if I can interject before Annette has a moment to speak, the other piece of that is dioceses underestimate the gifts and the treasures that survivors of clergy abuse can bring back home. There's an enormous faith that's gone through the darkness in the desert that we've all gone through, and through that conversation, a really profound healing takes place, not only among survivors, but among families and parishes, and even, whatever they call it, the Catholic Twitterverse, which is saying some pretty rough things. Mm-hmm. But there are pretty holy people who've come through this that have something amazing to share.
And I agree, and a lot of it is at the parish level. To be honest, that's where it starts. Because you have victims coming forward that are not just victims of clergy abuse.
That's right.
They are victims of all types of abuse. Mm-hmm. And so, excuse me, you have pastors and deacons at that parish level that are starting that process of spirituality in these victims at that level. And yes, some of them need to escalate or elevate to my level. But I think a lot of work goes on at the parishes.
Yeah.
You're so right.
Absolutely, and you raise a really good point there with respect to, this is a societal issue. People are experiencing sexual abuse, in all different contexts, and the problem here is that I think as a church we've allowed issues of liability to stop us from moving forward. We should be the leaders here. We should be the moral leadership that gives courage and inspires everybody else, and we've kind of been stopped because we so focused on that we forget about everything else. We need to get rid of that and move forward with courage.
And at the parish level too, what's really important is even once a survivor may have reported or a family member may have brought something up, they still need to have a home within the church if they so choose. And so the idea, one of our main themes of what we do is supporting trauma-informed ministry, which can only help everyone. It can help survivors find a home, their families find healing, but that applies to all the survivors who are coming in for healing, who are sitting in the pews, and while they're hearing the debate about this issue, they're experiencing it as survivors. So everything people say about survivors of clergy abuse, it's being heard by a lot of other survivors. And that's either terrible or it's really a hopeful moment.
And,
Depends.
And the message has created a dissonance too. If you're sitting in the pew and you hear priests or bishops or whatnot saying, saying, well, if you see this, you have to oppose this, and I've heard people mention money grubbers and things like that. It's that creates such a profound sense of dissonance for the people in the pews, because this isn't congruous with what they were taught in the Gospels. You go back to what we learned as children. What would Jesus do? Well, Jesus wouldn't do this. Exactly.
Right.
So.
Exactly. It's not. I think that people get frustrated and tend to focus in on the financial part of it, and not the healing or spiritual part of it.
That's right.
And that may be the more difficult one to address, is the spiritual one, because where are you in your spiritual journey? That is a difficult question to answer. Yeah. And especially when you're in the midst of anger.
Yes.
Yeah.
It could change from moment to moment.
That's right.
And so I think that it's a tough place to be in.
We make Spirit Fire makes the point that to lift a survivor up, there are the economic issues to kind of help somebody stabilize a life. Mm-hmm. There is also the therapeutic issue, which this is a psychological wound, it needs therapy, but often the spiritual has been delegated to that, which is kind of nutty since we're the church. So but when you integrate the three, and you honor the three, you touch the whole person and the whole person heals. I'm very fortunate because a number of dioceses have sent survivors to me from their diocese who felt just more comfortable talking to a survivor outside the diocese about their faith wound. Mm-hmm. So I'm very spoiled because I get to meet these people. I wish they weren't so wounded, but I get to hold up a mirror to the beauty of their resilience and their faith. Mm-hmm. And so that's something the church is losing out on, because there's some amazing stories.
Yes,
absolutely.
And the spiritual attack is like, personally for me, like, and about 5 years ago, I totally fell apart, and part of that was because my faith felt so undermined, because I didn't feel like I could trust anyone. Mm-hmm. I couldn't believe anyone. And it's something that I had struggled with for such a long time. And then finally, I didn't have the ability to push back anymore. And when you lose that, and when you lose that from your church, when all of a sudden your belief in God is shaken wholly, you don't know what's up, what's down, what's right, what's wrong. And we give in to cynicism. We give in to all these things. And it's only my journey, and part of it has been reaching out to people, seeing God where I couldn't feel God in myself. I would see God in other people, and drawing together with other people, and becoming, and working with my VAC in Brooklyn, and working with survivors groups, and seeing each person working on the review board. We would deal with such horrific issues, but still looking at each person and seeing what that person was doing, and the courage that person was approaching all these things. That has brought my faith back, and not, it's still a daily struggle. But it's when I look at people, when I see God in them, that's what brings me back.
Yeah. Which is a moment to say about VACs, a view in Spirit Fire that we share, is that VACs are an unrecognized ministry that's been in formation since 2002, and I would include that VACs and some child protection ministers, and I would also say not all, because different bishops have permitted different things, and different people have different skills. But what I'm saying is, we found that really us sitting here is the fruit of amazing VACs, because VACs are the first relationship that is begun before you even get to the review board, before anything else. The VACs are the ones that help you find spiritual directors who are safe, which is not always easy, and are often very under-supported on that spiritual level. I can't say the number of VACs that have shared with me these enormously fantastic backgrounds to serve, but ultimately an acknowledgement, gee, I'm ministering more than that.
That's right.
And so one of the things we want to do is really help VACs acknowledge that give them permission to see themselves as ministers, even if they're not getting that from home yet, to convince bishops that that's the case, and to give resources to them to help heal that wound between the church and survivors and families. So,
at its core, this is about betrayal. And it's about disappointment in the church, and it's about and this is a betrayal and disappointment that's shared by not just the survivors, but everyone. As we look at and we see that inconsistency. And the VAC, it's a vocation, it's not a job, and you're being called to be that face of Christ to this person, non-judgmental, not just you're there for that person. And hopefully that relationship brings the person back, because the people that I've known in Brooklyn, I've tested them every step of the way, and I've given them opportunities to I push back, I can be a pain sometimes, but it's but they've never failed me. And that's so important. And listen, we're humans, and humans fail sometimes. But it's having that opportunity, having that seeing that relationship develop again. That's the crux of the problem, I think, for a lot of survivors.
So how do you like that we just laid that on you?
You got nothing to do now.
So you go take care of it.
Did you write that down?
So how can the VACs, or the victim assistance coordinators, how can they kind of walk that line between those that they're ministering to, but also within the reality of the confines of the diocese, right? And what the diocesan policies and procedures are. So how can they kind of walk that balance?
So that's a difficult, sometimes a difficult road to go on. And just breaking down, if you look at my titles separately, okay, you look at victims. So victims, where you need to start is recognizing where they're at. Because I guarantee you, every person that I've met with has come in on a different level.
Yeah.
And so in talking to someone, luckily I, more often than not, I've had the luxury of meeting people in person. There are times when I have to speak to them over the phone, which isn't ideal, but at least it's something. Anyway, it's recognizing where they're starting at and being able to help them at that level. So assistance, exactly what it means, just giving them what they need. And then the coordinator is coordinating all of these things so that they can start, because as much as I want them to start their healing journey, unfortunately, they are the only ones that can do it. Yeah. I can help them. I can give them the help that they need to take that. Well, so first of all, the initial step that they took was coming in. Yeah. That was huge, and I recognized that, and I let them know it took a lot. It took years for you to be able to take this step. So now that you've taken it, this is what we can do to help you to take the next step, and then the next one. And so what happens, so after that is letting them be as much of a process as possible. And so, and I explain to everyone, confidentiality is on both sides. Mm-hmm. So the conversations that I have with them are confidential, and the confidentiality with the vicar, who I have to talk to, if the priest is still alive, those conversations, they're confidential also. Mm-hmm. I can let them know of things, and it may not appear that anything is happening, and I try to assure them as much as I possibly can, we are taking steps, and things are being done. And every case is individual, whether the priest is still in ministry or not. It may be, there may be some outward signs immediately if the priest is put on a leave of absence. They're going to know that. They're going to see that immediately. And again, that's a step. Mm-hmm. They're feeling that, and one of the things that has come up quite often, if not in all times, they need justice.
Yes, yeah.
That's right.
And they need to feel that justice is being done. Yeah. Unfortunately, I have no control over the legal system part of it. Yeah. Because that justice, for whatever reason, has the statute of limitations is run, or whatever the case may be, they may not be tried in a criminal court, which is a part of the justice that they need to feel. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I have no control over that. Yeah. But I can give them the information that they need to feel that things are being done without breaching confidentiality. Mm-hmm. And so that's where it's a very thin line. Yeah. And I'm more often than not saying, please bear with me. Please understand, I can't give you all the information, but I can tell you X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, yeah.
And I understand the frustrations with the justice aspect of that, because so much of that is beyond your control. And one of the things that, and I don't mean to disparage the legal profession.
You're really going to get.
I really. I'm just digging this hole deeper and deeper.
Yeah. Might as well keep going.
Yeah. Just go. I may end up in China. So, but often the bishops are being informed by their lawyers on one side, and all they hear is the fear of liability, the fear. Mm-hmm. And the VACs are often the only voice that they hear from the survivors. I would empower VACs to feel like you can go to the bishop and say, okay, that's one side, but maybe we should be thinking more about this. We should be thinking more about these issues of justice, just for the fact that you have the scriptures on your side. You know, it's a, you know,
Yeah.
you know, Christ, he turned over the tables. You know, he said, you know, this is messed up. I'm going to do something else with this.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the power that you have on your side. It's speaking that truth, expressing the suffering that these people are going through. And, you know, once again, I call upon my own experience with Brooklyn. I know that the VACs in Brooklyn have often put themselves in precarious positions because, you know, they've said things that may not seem shrewd, that may not seem wise. But, you know, this isn't about wisdom. This isn't about being shrewd. This is not about strategy. This is about truth. This is about justice. Yeah. This is about doing the right thing. I would love to see the bishops across the country recognize that and empower the VACs in order to be that voice, to push the church towards where it should be. And I think that's part of the ministry. So.
And I do think that I acknowledge also we come in all sorts of ways. My first conversation with my VAC was I picked up the phone, I'd found the telephone number, and I said, so is this window dressing? And I gave her a hard time for quite a few months to just see. And I had a lot of no-shows at different events until I was in a car checking her out, but I was very nervous. So it took me a long time, and it takes a lot of people a long time to come in. I do think there's another piece of all this. If there were practical things VACs could do, and I don't know how you do this, so I'm not suggesting you don't, but to be able to go through piecemeal the entire process carefully, even have a flow chart so that you can say, this is where we are, this is what's going on, and at this stage, these 18 things can be going on. And it's very complicated to make this statement, but at some point, survivors need to hear, sometimes we have to sit back to the law enforcement looks into all of this. We have to be careful. We're actually doing this for you by staying out of the way, but it slows us down. You know, that can make a lot of a difference to somebody who's, I know from survivors don't hear that, but I know the stage they're at in the review board, that's what they're going through. So I think that piece is helpful. And I also think there could be better work done to remove the backlog, to remove the number of cases of survivors who've brought in complaints, who are in review boards that are kind of stalled because of, let's say, law enforcement not sure enough to let go. Mm-hmm. There's got to be some extra step, something that can be done to get those people out of limbo, because it could be what's holding up their therapy and their spiritual development. But I also happen to believe, and this is probably where Spirit Fire and Healing Voices can be helpful, even when that review board process starts, there's no reason that a relationship can't be had with that survivor. And eventually you would have, Catholic-oriented survivor groups within your diocese. But for now, that's one of the people I talk to the most, because they can start looking and realizing what we all have had to cope with is there's legal justice, which is always going to be confined by man-made law. Mm-hmm. And there's justice in our faith, that we understand a greater justice, which is often what people are hungering for. But just through the spiritual wound, can't get the context and the process that they will do individually. So those are things where trauma-informed ministry becomes really an important training, because you start realizing, oh, I can help that person even while this process is going by. And the other thing is, I'll say, even when you tell us the process, but if we're really stressed, we'll forget it, but we'll really appreciate it. So tell us again.
And
I'm sure you do.
And I forget that. I mean, because it's like I have a checklist. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I want to make sure that you get the information for all of these things. And it's too much information at one time, right. Especially when someone comes in, they are stressed, and you're just unsure, and so here I am, and trying to give you all of this information. So thank you. Actually having a pre-made and give them the copy and say, here, this is where you are here.
Yeah, right.
And this is where, this road can go in a lot of different places. But
Right.
for right now, we're here.
Right.
I think that's excellent. Yeah, I do.
And that's so important because it's not okay, here's your thing, now go away.
Yeah.
It's come in, and they encounter you as a person who's going on this journey with them, and I think that's so important. It's in my survivors group. A lot of times, I find people talk about the they and the them and the church and stuff like that, and I try to remind them that the church isn't the bishops, it's not the priests, it's all of us. So and the church has different people who think in different ways, and when they encounter you, that's an opportunity for them to see somebody who understands them and who encounters them as a person, and I think that could be an absolutely beautiful thing, and that brings them back into what really is our faith and what is the church.
And you can also ask to talk to family members. You can,
Yeah.
because family members are wounded, and usually families have blown apart over this. That's another spirit-informed ministry. You can train priests and deacons and ministers, sisters, who won't say stupid things when you connect them up with survivors. There's all sorts of things that can be going on that will heal Catholics too.
Yeah.
So along those lines of accompanying with and journeying with throughout the entire process, which I think we kind of keep coming back to as obviously a core element of healing on both sides, but we had a couple of questions come in kind of relating to that. So one is, there are situations where litigation is going on and maybe the lawyers are saying, don't even mention the pastoral care, don't have any contact. Is there anything that you can recommend in those situations of how maybe is there anything that can be done?
Don't listen to them.
Yeah.
So what? Big deal.
Lawyers are notorious for having an opinion. Here's the hole. I'm going deeper. What's past China? But you know what? That's an opinion, and lawyers look at everything in a very discreet way. And that's what we're trained to do. We look at this very specific thing, and we protect our clients from that. We're talking about something a lot bigger than that. We're talking about our faith. We're talking about the church. We're talking about God. And it's good to you take that into account. You say, thank you very much. I'll respect that. But what this is about much more than that. This is about somebody's soul. This is about who we are as a church. And sometimes we have to do things that maybe seem unwise. We have to be courageous in order to follow our faith.
And I can't say that enough. I agree, because law looks at it like a problem to solve, which is great. There are problems to solve, and there's no need for a lawyer or to look at the diocese in different ways. But ultimately, it's a relationship that was wounded. It's not going to get fixed by litigation. Litigation's going to have its role, but what matters is what's the end goal? Where were we 20 years ago?
That's
lawyers had a lot of say. Where are we now?
Yeah.
And so what I would suggest is something even deeper, which is, let's say your lawyers are saying that right now and the diocese has to evolve further. We have ways of being able to talk to survivors outside that legal process, where at least they start getting some kind of spiritual help, if they want it, only if they want it. And also there have got to be people, and you can ask lawyers who are very smart, to say, well, how do we carve out something so that this person can, lawyers can figure out some way for this person to talk to some people with minimized or zero liability. Sign off, whatever you want to do. They're talking to therapists that way. Well, there must be some other way to make that happen. And I know lawyers will dislike us for that, but it's time to push back on the solely legal approach to healing the church, because just look at the news.
Exactly.
Well, and I also would encourage or let it's not just, it just doesn't end when the settlement
Yeah.
ends.
That's absolutely right.
When the settlement is signed off on, leave that window of opportunity open for that contact, because they may not be able or may not be ready for that relationship to start right then because they're clouded. Again, it goes back to they're angry and they want that justice and may feel that that's the only way that they can get justice right now.
That's right.
Sure. Right.
But a year from now, 6 months from now, 3 months from now, that changes. And when they know that that opportunity is still there to have that relationship, I think goes a long way.
I'd actually go a step further and suggest every diocese refuses to put restraining orders. They can put a restraining order against abusers or abusive people, but not between the diocese and the survivor.
Absolutely.
We're adults, we can opt in or opt out. And also, furthermore, I would suggest going back to the settlements that exist and asking for the right to have opt-in or opt-out for spiritual care. Just ask. And the people can say no, or the people can say, lift the restraining order enough that if I want to come and talk to you, I can. Because right now they can't either. So I think it's really important to understand that there are things within these legal settlements that have been harmful to all concerned. Because I'm talking to survivors who need help and talk to me, but they're in a diocese where it's very hard to reconnect, in part because there are legal restraints. And that's just, it's a telephone call to attorneys who, at this point, ought to be supportive of full healing of survivors.
You think in part about how we got to this specific thing. It's about fear. It's been about fear, and it's a fear that's stopped people from talking to each other, from seeing each other, from encountering each other. So certain bishops listen to their lawyers because lawyers are very good at protecting you from fear. They build you a little wall, but I think what we've discovered is that's not right for the church either. We have to find a way to overcome that fear and push back against that. One of the things, I've always considered this, one thing that we've discussed is that this is the devil's best work.
Yeah.
Because it's taken the innocence, the purity of children and that faith and used it as a conduit for evil. And not only impacting the children, but impacting our communities, impacting the priests, impacting bishops. So we're all separated from each other, we're all isolated, we're all alienated, we don't trust each other, we're cynical, we're skeptical. All of these things, it's pushed us all apart. And the only way to overcome that, to fight against that, is to come together, start trusting each other, start being courageous.
Okay, we have one more legal question, and then there's a couple of other ones that we'll throw out there too. So victim assistance coordinators, or the VACs, potentially get a lot of information that could be used in a criminal or civil defense of a priest, not by their choice, but just by, I guess, a case of everything going on. So how can the VACs and also the diocesan review boards, how can they make sure that they have everything appropriately transparent?
I can't speak to that. You two might.
Well, in terms of the review board, so when we get a case that's under litigation, criminal litigation, something like that, that's being led by the civil authorities. It's very situation specific, but usually that's the good first impulse there. A lot of this you have to look at the specific situation as to and you also have to see, what is necessarily part of a criminal or civil action, and what's part of healing, what's part of therapy, what's part of encountering the person. You can take information, you can, and I'm sure all the information you take in is protected to some degree. You can have that relationship, but still kind of, not deal with this other thing, because that survivor, that victim probably needs more of that relationship when he or she is going through that process. leaving that person by himself or herself at this time is not the best approach. So.
And you mentioned law enforcement, and that's a key relationship that plays into all this as well.
Yes.
Because I think along those lines, as long as the Diocesan Review Board, they're waiting until law enforcement, they've
That's
done
right.
their complete investigation first, then they pick up, from kind of within the church and do that more internal piece, then at that point, they've already established that transparency
That's
in that
right.
relationship.
And,
That's right.
I would love to see, instead of us thinking there's law enforcement here, there's the lawyers over here, we should all be on the same side here. It's at its core, it's protection of children, protection of innocence, protection of our faith. And I think we've allowed ourselves to be manipulated into different sides, and we really should all be on the same side here.
Absolutely.
So.
I am reminded of in mediation training. So, for example, if you're mediating a family dispute or divorce, and the minute you hear about child abuse, in my state, you're a mandatory reporter. So it's again talking about talking. Mm-hmm. So when you talk to a survivor, for example, as I would in mediation, you say up front, I'm a mandatory reporter on these things, because we're not going to know what that is. We're not going to know the situation when we sit down with you, because I can imagine where that could become a quandary if you hadn't forewarned a survivor. There are some things you can't withhold.
That's right.
Because that could be perceived as a betrayal when in fact it's a fantastic, a victim first coming and talking could perceive that as a betrayal when in fact it's a system put in place to make sure secrets aren't kept anymore. But it still can be upsetting, wounding the relationship, which is why you gotta let people know ahead of time. Everything you can let people know ahead of time and repeat helps.
Yeah.
Ties back into that flow chart too, if that's on there too, as far as mandatory reporting.
I know.
Absolutely, absolutely. So a lot of dioceses right now are looking at publishing their names of the accused clergy, credibly or substantiated. I know dioceses kind of have their own guidelines and processes that they're doing for that. But can you comment on as far as if the reality is that some names don't necessarily meet the standards of the charter, so they wouldn't be considered either charter cases or chartered priests? Maybe some of those names wouldn't get published depending on the diocese. So if you have a survivor who's been hurt, but maybe their offender is not on that list for whatever the specifications of that, how would you recommend they could still continue to minister to that person?
I'm not clear on that. I'm sorry.
So if there's a diocese is publishing their list of all their accused clergy, but maybe for whatever the parameters that they have on making the information public, say a survivor comes forward and has an allegation and their offender is not on that list, how could we still minister to that person?
I would take a step back from there because, and this is why I really think the church should pursue its own legislation with respect to this, because, and I've been very open. I know the abuser, my abuser, and who abused many other people, went on to become a professor at several colleges, went on to Yale Theological, went on to minister to the Latino community without there being any record whatsoever, because this person was smart enough to step out, bail, and just be free. I think we have a moral responsibility, if not an ethical and religious responsibility, to make sure that these people are on the record somewhere, and that no other communities are impacted or hurt, no other children are ever put in danger. And and something like a piece of legislation that addresses this, I think, is so important. It's perhaps, and I think that would create an opportunity for vetting to the point that we would be comfortable with saying, okay, this actually happened, or this person is sufficient enough of a danger that this person should be on this list.
Go ahead.
No.
You could also, there are other ways to talk about this. You have a relationship with a survivor, you can talk to them about why the person's not on. A lot of survivors, if you have a relationship with them, will understand, and it will still hurt, and you'll still walk with them through that. And it also depends on how much justice and how well this has been handled up until the point where you break that news. There are also ways of announcing, separately priests who have been put through, I don't know, but in some cases priests can be put through training again on from Virtus or something like that. So say these priests have found it beneficial because there have been some questions to go through this, because it at least says something important. But, you know, I personally have never felt the need to see my abusers' names published. I know that puts me at odds with most survivors, and I need to say this at the table for them, that it's really important for most. And also for people who don't know who to trust, and for priests who are all considered equally guilty until you start making distinctions. That having been said, the one thing, the worst thing can be releasing a list cynically handled by attorneys. And I know, God bless all attorneys, but so that in fact, it's presented as a solution to the problem. We can now move forward. And these are the guys that you should know about, and it's used as cover for others who are on the, you know, are for some legal reason, not a just reason, kept off the list. That'll come back.
Yeah.
We see it, and it's going to come back. So I caution anyone who's using the dance between who's on the list and who's not. You're hurting the church if you're using it as a tool.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm all for keeping innocent priests from having their reputations ruined. A shout out to all priests who carry this burden, because some can be accused and even misunderstood, as opposed to just a complete false accusation. A person can now use this who's troubled for other reasons. That said, the church and diocese owe it to each other to make sure that that list doesn't become a cynical tool, because we've, you know,
That's right.
it's not going to go away then.
And you're right about innocent priests, because, you know, in some of our cases we had issues where a priest was falsely accused, and you know, you want to make sure that that person is cleared. You know, that person doesn't carry that taint, and you get at that through a very thorough investigation. You know, a lot of this stuff isn't that well hidden. You know, a lot of this stuff, and I think if you dedicate yourself to finding where the truth is, I would say that most of the time you're able to get there.
Yeah. But I do think those priests who go through this and who are cleared need much more support when they walk back into their parishes for having been cleared.
Yeah.
And I think that's, and still the person who made the accusation still deserves care and spiritual support, but that priest needs to be really cared for.
Absolutely.
So, and again, it's something that, because there are criteria that is set up, because the Archdiocese of Santa Fe has published a list. It originally, it was published in about a year ago, and it's fluid, it changes.
Yes.
And a group of there are many of us that have contributed to it's painstaking to go through every single name and make sure that the information is correct. And we also updated the list to include assignments that they were at, and that proved to be a huge challenge. But after all that, if the name still just does not meet the criteria, that doesn't lessen the fact that this person perceives themselves as being a victim, and still I don't see anything that would prevent us. Again, I agree with you. There are some people, excuse me, that need to see that name published. They need to see it. That's where we need to come in and say, because that wasn't done, that does not mean that you can't
That's right.
start.
That's exactly right.
That's right.
Absolutely.
And it's all, again, relationship. If you can talk about it 12 times because we
That's right.
forget, because it's very stressful, and then you can also fold in options. They can walk away from all the options, but there will be some options they might very well like. What you don't want to do is send them to spiritual counseling where you haven't really worked over the person counseling them, because that's a counselor that's really can't make a mistake. Like, oh, get over it. You know, that kind of thing.
And this is where they encounter your humanity.
Yeah.
And encounter
we-
Christ through you, and you know the difficulty that you're having with this, and you know, so they see you as that person, you know, and who's with them on this journey, who's equally frustrated by the inability to find the truth here. I think that's so important. Yeah.
Now, we've talked a lot about the justice aspect of which, of course, is definitely important. And like you said, many people, that's what they need in addition to all of their other needs. But someone is asking the question as far as she's heard of survivors that just want an apology and not necessarily justice.
Yeah.
Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's, you know, each person has to determine what he or she is comfortable with, you know, and you know, it's.
Yeah, all I've wanted is an apology, and they're still working on it, but I think that is what heals families. I think it's what says something about good happening on the other side, because to be able to acknowledge and apologize means you've already taken an important step, and I think that's really critical. And I think it's the kind of apology that can't be a 3-line form letter. It's out of a relationship of some type where we understand and we see, and the apology is lived out by a lot of acts before the apology ever happens, because it's an acknowledgement of what we've gone through. But yeah, I know a lot of survivors, when the legal piece is over, come away feeling, oh, it just, you know, I thought it was going to feel better. But it's the apology and the relationship. And also the church is you know, I gotta say this, and the church isn't doing justice just giving an apology. It's also letting that survivor, letting us use that in our healing, because we can get stuck in places. So just because someone gives you an apology doesn't mean they get to become then abusive then. Then it's a question of our character, our growth. That's where survivors help survivors, because that's not a healthy place to stay either. But you can't even see it in yourself until you've really seen the other people take a step forward. Oh, I can let this go.
Absolutely.
You know, it never goes away.
I do have to slightly amend what I said before, because you know, at the same time, I'm thinking, okay, so is this person a danger? Is this person, you have to take into account also, what does this person do after this? Is this person who legitimately committed a crime? If so, those things have to be weighed in. You know, and there's no easy answer here. There's absolutely no easy answer, except if you think there are other children in danger, except if you think that this person can go on to abuse others, then that's clear cut. And so perhaps that survivor is only wants an apology, but I don't think that removes the church from a further obligation to help pursue this further.
Yeah,
That's true.
That's a great point.
And also, if the abuser, let's say it's an abuser of a 18-and-a-half-year-old person, and that's, I don't know how different dioceses define this. There should be enough happening that the survivor sees that something's being done to protect adults, vulnerable adults. So I just thought it's good that we amend these things. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and if anything, you know, I think that's something that's very positive that's come out of the summer, is that a lot of dioceses have realized, hey, okay, we need to start putting in some of these protections for seminarians, for the 18 and a half year olds, for all the other young adults, for the adults, everybody in between.
That's right.
The charter
right.
at the moment, we're dealing with minors and we're dealing with the vulnerable adults, but what about everybody else?
That's right.
So that's what now I think a lot of places are starting to look at to say, you're right, it's just because they don't fit in this box doesn't mean that they don't deserve the same healing, the same resources, the same accountability on the other side as those that do.
If I may, I also think this is where VAX could really have a big effect, because the dialogue in the parishes everywhere seems sorely malinformed of what the charter has already accomplished. And it personally drives me crazy, because the only reason I can come back to the church is that I know that there's been so much effort keeping children safe. So there besides listening sessions where bishops and the diocese are listening to Catholics in general, which is appropriate, at some point Catholics owe it to listen to the church and to hear what they clearly don't hear based on what people are saying. This is what we have done. This is what we are working on. It's very different from what people are seeing in international news. And until Catholics get that straight, and I can't tell you what I'm hearing back in terms of not knowing the distance, the distinction. I think that there could be programs of, okay, now we'd like you to listen back to us. Maybe at pinwheel events where you have child protection and you ask for prayer services, people are motivated, and by the way, afterwards, we'd like Catholics as part of their duty to know. It doesn't take long to explain.
And maybe this is part of what we do by, this used to be the dirty, shameful secret, that only some of us carried. And other people knew about it, but they didn't want to talk about it. Mm-hmm. That's part of what we're doing. We're bringing this out. We're creating an environment where everyone is talking about this. And it's not so much as a dirty shame, it's a challenge to all of us to move forward. And with respect to protecting children, with respect to owning these issues and saying, okay, this is never going to happen again, and making this a broader ministry, not just something that survivors deal with, but where the whole church looks at this and says, okay, this is a reflection of Christ's suffering. What are we going to do with this? So.
Yeah.
So as far as resources, and we've talked to some about the practical application of a lot of this, can you recommend any specific resources as far as trauma-informed ministry to use with people in the parishes?
Well, we happen to have some.
We'd love for you to share about those.
Should I start? He's like, can I keep her from starting? If you go to spiritfire.live, there's endless amounts of resources for free. There are webinars that priests and ministers can watch online that are 10 minutes long that give tips in terms of how to offer spiritual care. It's not the same as a conversation or a group discussion, but it's very good. There's Veronica's Veil, which is mentioned there too, which is a very large workbook that survivors and ministers use to kind of navigate all the issues that are coming up in therapy from a Christian and Catholic point of view. And we have the very Catholic issues that can trigger survivors early in therapy toward the back, so that they can even kind of not get there till they're ready. Mm-hmm. We also have a short essay on how survivor discussion groups can kind of start, and tips from that. And it's a dialogue between a priest friend of mine, Father Lou Fiorelli, who's an Oblate de Sales, who's now provincial, and myself, in terms of what even pastoral counseling could look like. So it kind of gets people's creative juices going for how they would approach it. So we have, probably 30 webinars. We have over 60 articles available for printing out for free. We have 4 books that are recommended. One is Acts of Recovery by Mike Hoffman, a very short book that talks about his process of going through the review board and how he also took 10 steps for his own healing, which really help when we hand it to somebody about to start a review board discussion, because they see another survivor who did that. And then we, of course, are working with dioceses directly to help them let's say, take all the different things they're doing up a notch, child protection, VACs, and review boards, for example, and their ministries, often non-existing, that are trauma-informed. And we also are starting a pilot program with the Diocese of Albany in January of a kind of integrated approach to care for survivors, which then Bishop Scharfenberger will make available to everybody within 3 to 4 months. But you can call us and ask us about it, and we'll tell you what we're doing, just in case you want to copy it right away. There's no reason to hold back. And then also, I do a lot of workshops, even teleconference workshops for people who don't have any, budget, to just talk about trauma-informed ministry. And then we're doing consultation with bishops in terms of just how they're thinking about it, because a lot of bishops haven't talked to survivors. So sometimes we'll just talk about what has worked and not worked for us. And that really helped in Baltimore, and since then we've talked to quite a few. Mm-hmm. So I think I covered everything.
Yeah.
Did I?
Yeah.
It's like you can't hold me back. It's like blah, blah, blah. But I did forget something. On the Healing Voices magazine, which you can find at thehealingvoices.org, mm-hmm. we have a VAC pack with all sorts of information about trauma-informed ministry. We have a parish how-to, which is a do-it-yourself for holding an event that would be a prayer service and potentially a pinwheel for prevention event, and informing Catholics and parishes about child protection and how to do that effectively. We've even got forms if you want to copy our forms. And we also invite people to come and write, and send survivors who want to come and write, or send survivors to us or to me, because I will talk to survivors long distance about anything.
That's great. Well, we definitely appreciate you sharing all of your resources and everything with us too, which is perfect.
One of the things, and just I love the name Spirit Fire, because I think it points to an Episcopal moment in our church, and and I apologize to Bernie because I don't remember the quote, but it's along the lines of "There's no darkness, no evil that God can't overcome," and I think this is a challenge to us in the church. This is an evil, this is shameful, this is secretive, and I think we're being challenged to ignite the church and turn this into something good and something holy, and call us all. And so it's not, like I said before, not just about survivors, victims. It's about all of us as a church coming together. And I would love to see us pull that out of this. And there are ways for us to do it too. I think more support for VACs, more giving people protocols across the country where it's not so specific to each diocese, where everybody looks at the church as the church. So you should be able to walk into one diocese and expect the same treatment that you get in any other diocese. I think. Just by the fact that this is all faith-based, should drive that. So anything that we could do to move in that direction and create a set of protocols, create standards that everyone's using, I think that's very important.
Absolutely. Those are all definitely great resources and different things for folks to consider too. As far as, this is a question about the vulnerable adults. Why can't adults being victimized due to being placed in a vulnerable position being considered a vulnerable adult, such as an unbalanced relationship, a priest-teacher, seminarian, blackmail, that sort of thing? That one, I'll go ahead and address. It really just ties back to the definition in the Charter, and the definition in the Charter comes from canon law. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, that's not something that you can easily change. So the definition in the Charter is those are considered vulnerable adults who habitually lack the use of reason, which is why it's a definition in the Charter. Now, as a diocese, though, dioceses can take that as far as they want and always do more than what the Charter says. So as a diocese, if you want to expand, who you're able to offer these resources for, as far as who you would consider to be a vulnerable adult, you definitely have the power to do that. Your bishop has the power to do that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we have the resources to help you.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So we've got some wonderful folks right here who are willing to help out with this. And I believe we have all of your links on our website, so we'll have to verify that and make sure that we have all that. But it is in the resource toolbox as well. if anybody's looking in the toolbox or on our website, we'll make all that available for you too. So we mentioned support, that's definitely something that's continuously needed, but how can we kind of support each other as far as victim survivors with the victim assistance coordinator and that mutual relationship with other, maybe leaders of the diocese or even at the parishes? What are some thoughts on how we can support one another moving forward?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
I talked last.
Dialogue is so important. And, it's, I think VACs feel this. I think bishops feel this. I think priests feel this. I think creating this network, creating this opportunity for this dialogue where people can have that discussion, and not just, I'm off in my corner, I'm going to do something there, and not share that information with everybody else. I think this is such a difficult area that we need to know that we're part of something greater. VACs should be having a discussion amongst themselves. Bishops should be having a discussion amongst everybody who's touching on this should have, and even people who aren't, who are interested in this issue. We need to create a venue for that dialogue.
And Spirit Fire will be, we have a facility being renovated now in upstate where we will be having and welcoming people to come together, VACs, survivors from different places, so that conversations can happen. But I think that the way to support each other right now is to inform each other. Because I really think right now there are so many different factions of the church who've hijacked this topic for their own, in very meaningful conversations. This is not to say that some of the controversies aren't important, but they certainly don't have to do with child abuse. And to be able to inform people what this is and what the church has done well and what the church is looking to do better, and then also has to completely, like in terms of vulnerable adults, make some big changes. I think that if people can understand that place, then they can start talking together. Right now, it's just an argument over what's the topic du jour for me to argue with and kind of take out on the church or the bishop or whatever, including one's own anger over the fact that maybe there's abuse of some other type in your background. So it's really learning how to reconfigure this conversation, which is where we're coming at it, and survivors can really bring that to the dialogue. So I do think events that help people ask and challenge Catholics to come in and learn what this is about and encourage them to have their debates over other topics separately. Yeah. I think you use the word don't conflate.
That's right.
There's no reason to conflate this because nothing's going anywhere, even the other arguments, unless we parse it all out and talk it out in pieces. And one of the pieces I care the most about right now is this. So that's my...
This is the one issue that we can all agree on. This is the one thing. There's like no gray area. This is it. So to the extent that everything else is important, as you said, but this is the issue we have to deal with, and everything else can be another discussion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we're trying to get started in our archdiocese, which I hate to use the word forming another committee, but a group of us in the diocese coming together to help me, and to come up with ideas of support. And again, of course, we agree that information is the key. The more information you have, the better you are equipped to combat anything else. Mm-hmm. So by bringing a group of people together who could have creative ideas and say, look, maybe we can do this. Right. And this could be a next step for us. Right. We are in the process of doing that, but I think that is something that we can have to support one another in our ministries.
I'd add that, people think this is in the past. Yeah. And child abuse is getting worse. It's worse than when I was a child. just in terms of predators online that are approaching children at 8 and 12
Yes.
to groom them so that they can be plucked out at 15 and 16. This is not the abnormal.
Yeah.
And this is going into every demographic home. So that what VACs have to offer in terms of all of the parishes is huge. And that is absolutely critical in terms of even informing parents of, for 20 minutes, what to watch for will make a difference between your child being a prey or your child being safe. So this isn't all about past history. This is about really sincere child protection. And I work in human trafficking, and I'm horrified by how what was anathema, what was unusual with us, is now commonplace all through the computer in your house. That alone, let alone in the world at large. So I think people should remain mildly alarmed enough to go learn from their VACs something now for their children now.
And you know, in addition, like even for those of us whose crime, who, you know, the abuse happened years ago, this is still a daily occurrence, because every day I struggle with my faith. Every day I struggle with betrayal. Every day I struggle with who I cannot trust. And so we wake up every morning and we revisit that. And so, you know, it's hard to understand that. It was hard for me to understand that, you know, until I learned to reach out to other people. But, you know, this is something that recurs every day. And we use PTSD as the paradigm for this. But it's a little different. You know, PTSD, you know, a lot of the times that occurs to people who are adults. This happened at the most developmental stage of a children's life. And it happened not just on the level of, you know, a trauma, but it's also a spiritual trauma. This is something that, you know, we really don't understand, and everything we can do to understand it, I think that's more important. But, you know, at the same time, you know, listening to you talk about bringing this group together, that's the Holy Spirit. That's God bringing us together. I didn't know Melanie and Bernie a couple of years ago. I didn't know Teresa a couple of years ago. But we're all being brought together for a reason, you know, and that's where our strength is, and that's where God is. So.
Absolutely. So if you could kind of summarize maybe what opportunities do we still have, or what's still needed as far as the church to continue to move forward?
Go ahead.
Well, you want to go first?
Even maybe one or two things that you could think of at the top of your head of what do we still need to do? How can we continue to bring more healing for the entire church?
Well, okay, on a purely conceptual level, I want to see courage. I want to see inspiration. I want to go to church, you know, and I want to see the same courage that I expected to, that you know, I look in, you know, when I go see the Avengers movie or something like that, you know, because that's what inspires people. We're not inspired by cynicism. We're not inspired by skepticism. We're not inspired by any of those things. We should receive the same inspiration from our church that we get from everything else, even more so. Some like very specific things, I would love to see a national registry. I would love to see something like that, where we say, and it's saying, you know what, we not only have we taken care of our house, we're looking at broader society, we're looking at everybody, you know, because we have a moral and ethical obligation there. Things along those lines that inspire us.
I would think somewhat more operationally that I think if you look at the wound that happened was between children and their our innocence and really the priests and their holiness, and then from there they were rippling out. Families were wounded, families remain wounded, parishes and dioceses, priests, Catholics, ministers. So I think there's a tall tale, a tall order. In that regard, I would say between the church and survivors and their family members who've been wounded, to ignore that it's a problem and to look at it as a relationship and to start from those basic things, bearing in mind we forget all the time. So please, you know, anything in writing is helpful. Then I also think besides trauma-informed ministry training being good for that conversation further, and also letting priests know, in a world where the zeitgeist is one of victimization, how to speak to a broader group of people. It also heals priests and sisters and deacons, and I've seen it happen. So I think you take seriously, you're healing a lot of people. And I think the other thing is, on a parish level, I think you've got to get in there with parishes who are all now abuzz with this topic and shift it to the positive truth of child protection now, of what the church has done and needs to do, so that they, as angry as people are, they'll know what they're angry about, because that's how we move forward. And that's why I would love to see every parish be invited to have some kind of pinwheel prevention and prayer service for the dignity of children, so kids, when they're attending, aren't thinking about abuse, but rather their dignity. Because you're going to have abused children sitting in that prayer service, and I'd like them to hear the dignity prayed about till they find help. And then you really become a leader, but it's going to take time, and the first thing is to make sure people know what they're arguing about.
Yeah. And I want to highlight a piece of what you mentioned earlier as far as the formation aspect, which ties back again into Article 17 of the Charter, of continuing that formation for all deacons, all priests, all bishops.
Right.
And what does that look like? It's not just do this, don't do this, here you go, but it's as ministers, as the leaders of the church, but also then playing down to the faithful. Like you mentioned earlier, Louise, the church is not the hierarchy. The church is everybody, all of us, all of the laity that's involved in that. Absolutely.
And we actually do have the answer to darkness and death, in that we are a resurrection people, and we've lived that. So we know that that's not just a poetic statement.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so this may not be very popular, but it ties in actually with that continuing formation, because I see it almost on a daily basis, where some priests and deacons, they've been through the training. Absolutely. We're making sure that they're in compliance with the charter. But they are detached.
Yes.
Sure.
And that happened over there. And that wouldn't happen here in our parish.
Right.
And I want to use the word outreach, but not just outreach to our victims, outreach to our priests and our
Absolutely.
clergy, outreach to them to make it something that is thought about at the front end of a project or a decision or something, an event, instead of at the back end.
Yeah.
Oh, well, should I have thought of
Yeah.
something to... Oh, I know. I meant to call Annette to ask her if we could do this, or if we're doing this in compliance, or how many chaperones do I need? Think of that at the front end.
Right. Right.
And so by outreach, that's what I mean, is by giving continued, updated information to our clergy.
Yeah.
And that's why that clergy, there's one thing to be trained in the basics of policy, which are critical, because policy has a heart to it in this case, keeping kids safe. It's another thing for priests to start taking another step in terms of their formation and their vocation, in fact, can become part of the healing in the church. So it's not a thing in the past that now there are legal obligations only, but there's a reason, because priests become invested and they understand it's not just now dealing with attorneys or the legal stuff. It's more, wow, this is part of what I can be in the world, which is why when you start attaching healing to the Passion, when you start attaching healing to Scripture, all of a sudden it's of a bigger piece, and it validates everything the SERVACs are doing, which is important.
Yeah, and that detachment is dangerous. We're not called to observe Christ carrying the cross.
Right.
I think we're called to carry the cross with him. You know, and I think that's a threshold that we have to move past. You know, sometimes I joke, you know, it's when you go to a funeral and you say, you know, I'm sorry, and it kind of cuts off all further discussion. You know, we have to move past that. It can't be I'm sorry and move away. It's got to be I'm sorry and, you know, what can we do together, you know, going forward.
Or also, I'm sorry, and you share a story about the person.
There's nothing more healing than sharing stories across this division line of the wound. Because survivors have profound faith stories that nobody's been listening for. And the church has all the stories of Scripture. And you know what? They all look like each other. And nobody's making the argument. But when priests and ministers start doing that too, they start realizing the profound importance of what you do too. I really have seen it. And it's not that they don't now know, but now they internalize, wow, and they realize that child protection is here and now, and that there's a lot of people who've been victimized that can benefit from what they learned from us. So
we're almost out of time for today. Oh, absolutely. We've got a couple more minutes.
No, could I add something to my Christmas wish list? So I know this is the third rail, you know, but I would love, and I was talking about inspiration before, I would love to see the church back legislation across the country with respect to looking at these issues, with respect to statute of limitations, and finding a way to do it, you know, with intelligence, with dedication. I think you could find a way to do that in a reasonable manner. And you know, until we do that, I think you still have that dissonance between what we're saying and what we're doing.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other kind of just closing thoughts while we wrap up, as far as maybe a couple of takeaways that you'd like folks to kind of keep pondering?
Gosh, I don't know. There's a lot that's going through my mind as far as come back to us, and that's what I want to tell. I want to be able to tell survivors or victims or just fallen away Catholics, as far as like, give us a second chance.
My two takeaways are spiritfire.live and the Healing Voices magazine. What are you two takeaways?
Inspire me with your courage. You know, it's there's a little kid. My wife says that he's actually a lot bigger than a little, but you know, there's an 11-year-old kid that wants to be inspired. You know, and I think we all want that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I know for me, we kind of keep coming back to the themes of just walking together, journeying together, relationship, and that's so critical in everything that we do. So again, I want to thank you all for our relationship with you and how you've been willing to continue to work with us and keep the dialogue moving forward as well. So thank you so much for your time today. We've got those resources for you that Teresa mentioned as well, so please feel free to take a look at that. And if anybody at your diocese is interested in viewing this webinar later, or perhaps later on, we'll have everything up on our website later, and we'll send out that link when it's available too. So thank you for tuning in, and until next time.